بسم الله نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. So yesterday we spoke about the open calling of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also the Islam, the acceptance of Islam from Sayyidina Hamza, and then 3 days later Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhum, and the Quraysh trying to reach an agreement with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he stops spreading his message and they will give him whatever he wants. And we see the refusal of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he continues. So now the Quraysh with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam refusing, and now also with seeing that Hamza has become Muslim and Umar bin Khattab has become Muslim radiallahu ta'ala anhum, they see that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is gaining now gaining strength, and also that there's more prominent of members of the Quraysh are becoming Muslim. And so now that they fear the message of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and what he's calling to even more than they did before, so they decide that because he's causing trouble that they're going to now kill him. And so they agree upon killing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so they ask the Bani Hashim and the Bani Muttalib to hand over the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they ask Abu Talib, who refuses, who said, no, we will not give him no matter what you do, he's one of ours and we will not hand him over. And so because they cannot kill him now either, so they decide that as the other tribes of the Quraysh, that they will come together and they will ostracize the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and all of those Muslims and anybody that affords protection to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to the Muslims. So that includes the Bani Hashim and the Bani Muttalib, the two tribes of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that all of them will be ostracized, and that there will be a blockade that nobody is allowed to marry them, nobody is allowed to deal with them, buy and sell with them, nobody is allowed to support them, that you can't trade with them, and nobody can have mercy upon them until that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is killed. That this will be in place, and that until he is killed. And they drew up a document, and this document was placed inside the Kaaba. And so this blockade lasted 3 years, which was that there was all of these things, and there was no dealing with the Muslims, and that nobody was allowed to trade, even buy and sell goods with the Muslims. And so some say that the blockade started before the first migration, which was to Abyssinia, and some say it was after the first migration, but before the Islam of Sayyidina Umar. So we see that through this blockade, not only do the Muslims suffer, but also the Muslims and the non-Muslims suffer due to this, and due to the Muslims being on the side of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the non-Muslims, and those mainly from the Bani Hashim and the Bani Muttalib, who was supporting and giving protection to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, except for Abu Lahab being the paternal uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whose name is Abdul Uzza bin Abdul Muttalib, who sided with the Quraysh, so he was still considered, he was exempt from this embargo. And so we saw that now during these 3 years that the state of the Muslims became really bad, and to the point where they were eating the fodder of animals, the camels, the food that was given to the camels, and the leaves and shrubs of trees and the like. And this was the state of the Muslim in Mecca at the time. And so we see that in the 3rd year that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends woodworms to go and eat the document that was placed inside the Kaaba, and Jibreel alayhi salam informs the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about this, that the document has been eaten, and the whole document has been eaten except the places where it mentions Allah, that the name of Allah, that those places remained intact. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells his uncle Abu Talib about this, and he says, Abu Talib says, who's told you? So was this from your Lord? And he says, this is from my Lord. And so Abu Talib goes to the Quraysh, and he says to the Quraysh that this is what Muhammad is telling us, that the document has been eaten up, and you know him to be somebody who's never lied. So you should lift this embargo. So they said, we'll go and check the document. And so they go inside and they bring the document out, and they take it out of it's in a pouch, a leather pouch, and they take it out and they see that what the Prophet ﷺ said was true. And Abu Talib had agreed that, he said that if, when you go in and you find the document as we say it is, then you will lift this embargo. And that if it isn't, and that Muhammad is lying, then we will give him to you, that you can do with him as you please. And so they agree, and they bring out the document, and they find that the document's been eaten everywhere except the places where it says Allah's name, just as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had described. And so they immediately say that the Prophet ﷺ has casted a spell on the document, and that due to this spell, that's why there's some kind of sorcery or the like, and they reject it. But a few of the Quraysh, they stand up because this was the agreement that they had made, and also some of them saw now that after 3 years that this was unfair treatment of people who were ultimately their own people. They were people of the Quraysh, and the first of them was Zuhair ibn Umayyah, who stood up and he called the embargo, he called it unjust, and the unjust treatment of a tribe which is one of their own. And so he said we should remove this embargo, and thus it was. Others stood up and they agreed that they will remove this embargo. So now we also see at this time that news spreads in Habasha, in Abyssinia, that the Muslims who had migrated there, that they heard that Mecca had accepted Islam, and through this news it was an opportunity for them to return home. So we saw that because they had heard that Mecca had accepted Islam, they began to return home. Some of the Muslims did, but as they got back to Mecca, they realized that it was actually, the news was false and it wasn't true. And from amongst, with some of those that returned back, was Sayyidina Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. Came with him a delegation from Abyssinia, from Habasha, and it was consisted of 30 Christian men, and that when they came, they saw and they sat with the Prophet ﷺ, and they saw his condition of living and how he was living, and they were sent by Najashi as well to go and find out about this man who claimed prophecy and about this religion. And they sat with the Prophet ﷺ, they listened to the Quran, they listened to him speak, and they became Muslim. And their job was to go and find out and inquire what was going on, but they sat with the Prophet ﷺ, and they immediately accepted Islam because they saw it as the truth, and they knew from their text that these were the signs of a prophet, and so they accepted. And when Abu Jahl, he heard of this, and he came and he saw them, and he said to them, he said, I've never seen a more foolish bunch of riders. Your people sent you to find out about this man, and no sooner you left your own religion and believed what he said. Your people sent you to find out about him, and as soon as you got here, you've left your own religion and you've taken his and you've believed his. And so now we see just after this, so when this delegation, they accepted Islam and they returned back to Habasha, we see now a second migration, and this time it's 83 men and 18 women who migrated to Abyssinia, to Habasha, due to this 3-year embargo. The state of the Muslims was dire, and so the Prophet ﷺ allowed those who were able to go and migrate to Habasha, and from amongst them was Ubaydullah bin Jahsh and his wife Habiba, whose name is Ramla bint Abu Sufyan, who's the daughter of Abu Sufyan, who's the chief, one of the chiefs of the Quraysh. And when they arrived in Habasha, not too long later, Ubaydullah, he converted to Christianity there, and he died. But his wife Habiba, she remained upon Islam and became one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ later. And so after this, when the embargo was lifted, so this was now from the 7th year until the 10th year. In the 10th year of after prophecy, we see that the embargo is lifted, and this is where we see the passing of the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, his beloved wife Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, that she leaves this world. And some say it was due to the effects of this 3-year embargo that had such an effect upon her health that she passed away from this. May Allah be pleased with her. And this left the Prophet ﷺ very sad, because this was someone that was always there as a support for him, who was, when he came initially with the revelation, and he was the first person he spoke to was Khadija, and she accepted immediately and comforted him and reassured him that now that she had passed away, radiallahu ta'ala anha, and she was also the mother of his children, and only a few days, some say a month later, and 1 month and 5 days later, that we see his uncle Abu Talib, who passes away in his late 80s, and that when he passes away, again he's lost the Prophet ﷺ, someone very close to him, someone who had raised him, someone who also afforded him protection when he was calling to Islam, and someone who was a father figure to the Prophet ﷺ. So in a very short space of time, he lost his wife and he lost his uncle. And now with the passing of his uncle, of Abu Talib, this was an opportunity for the Quraysh to seize, to persecute him even more, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they did just that they began to, he saw that the doors that were open to him before were now closed in terms of his da'wah, in terms of his calling, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the persecution from the Quraysh became even more intense and even more much more persecution than he had faced before. And so the Prophet ﷺ called this year the year of the sorrow, and it's not just simply because he lost his wife and he was grieving this whole year. That's not true. And the Prophet ﷺ grieved, and he missed his wife for the rest of his life, ﷺ, and he spoke about her. But grieving was, as we do, the open grieving is for those 3 days. And then he lost his uncle as well. But this is not why he called it the year of sorrow, but he called it the year of sorrow because he saw in this year that the doors that were open to him before in terms of calling to Islam, he found those doors closed, and it was even more difficult and less people were accepting Islam. And so he called it the year of sorrow because he was striving and doing his best, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he was seeing that people were not accepting Islam, and that and he saw it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as a shortcoming from his side, which it wasn't at all. And so we see that the Quraysh now, this is where when they see him praying, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by the Kaaba, they would throw things on his back when he was in sajda, throw dirt on his head. And due to all these trials and tribulations, he called it the year of sorrow. And some of the wisdom why we see that Allah took Sayyidina Khadija, took Abu Talib from the Prophet ﷺ, was that these two individuals afforded the Prophet ﷺ much protection and support. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see that from the wisdom of removing this protection and this support was to show that nobody could say that his message spread because of these individuals or because of the support that was given to him and the protection that was afforded to him by Abu Talib, but rather Allah showing that it was him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that afforded him protection, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that gave him the support, and it was all due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this protection was not protection of him being persecuted, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but protection of the message being spread. That Allah opens the doors and closes the doors as He pleases, azza wa jal. So after Sayyidina Khadija passes away, we see that some of the Sahaba are concerned with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and yet he still has a young daughter in Sayyidina Fatima az-Zahra, and that who will take care of the Prophet's household. And so the Sahaba begin concerned that he should, and they think that he should marry again. And so one of the Sahabiyat, Khawla bint Hakim, she goes to the Prophet ﷺ and she proposes to him that he should marry either the daughter of his friend Abu Bakr as-Siddiq or Sayyidina Sauda bin Zam'a. And the Prophet ﷺ agrees, and he says to Sayyidina Khawla that she should go and speak to Abu Bakr and go and speak to Sayyidina Sauda. And so Sayyidina Sauda radiallahu ta'ala anha, she was married before and she was a widow, and her husband was a Sahabi, a Sakran, and both of them migrated to Abyssinia. And Sakran passed away in Abyssinia, and Sayyidina Sauda returned back to Mecca, and she had 5 children with Sakran. So she was a widow herself, and Khawla suggested her to the Prophet ﷺ because she was in a similar situation, a widow with children, and the Prophet ﷺ had lost his wife, and he had children. So she comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ agrees, and he sends Khawla to go and speak to Sauda. And when Khawla comes to Sayyidina Sauda, and she says that, would you like a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Sayyidina Sauda says, what is that blessing? And then she mentions that the Prophet ﷺ has sent me to ask for your hand in marriage. And Sayyidina Sauda is overcome with joy and happiness. And this is at a moment where she's left with young children and no husband, so she has no way of earning an income, and she's grieving. And Sayyidina Khawla comes to the Sayyidina Sauda and suggests this to her, and Sayyidina Sauda is overjoyed with the news, and she accepts immediately. But she says, you should go and speak to my father and get his acceptance as well. So Sayyidina Khawla goes to her father and says that Muhammad bin Abdullah has sent me to ask for Sauda's hand in marriage. And he says, Muhammad bin Abdullah bin Abdul Muttalib? She says, yes. And he says, what a noble match, what a noble person for my daughter. And so he says, what does my daughter say? What does Sauda say? And she says, Khawla replies, she agrees, and she's happy with the marriage. And then they are married. The Prophet ﷺ is married to Sauda in Ramadan in the 10th year after prophecy. And so we see from Sayyidina Sauda radiallahu ta'ala anha that she was somebody who was very light-hearted and of a joking manner, and she was older than his other wives sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But she was very light-hearted and very welcoming, and she would take care of the other wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and was always concerned with how they were doing, and she was always concerned with how others were, and she would joke with them, and she would visit others, and she was very charitable. She would give lots of money. When Sayyidina Umar, after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, Sayyidina Umar during his khilafah sent her some money, that she asked what it was, and she was told that it was gold coins, and so she distributed it all amongst the poor radiallahu ta'ala anha. And from her joking manner, that she was once, when the Prophet ﷺ was in the house of Sayyidina Sauda, and he was praying, so Sayyidina Sauda began to pray behind him. And so she says to the Prophet ﷺ after he's finished, she says that you were praying, and I started to pray behind you, but you went into ruku', and that when you were in ruku', you took so long that I feared that I was going to bleed, so I held onto my nose out of thinking that I was going to bleed, so I pinched my nose so I don't bleed. And the Prophet ﷺ found it funny in seeing the image of Sayyidina Sauda in ruku' and holding her nose, and he began to laugh sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And Sayyidina Sauda is laughing when she's telling the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam this. Another time that she was very close to Sayyidina Aisha and Sayyidina Hafsa and Sayyidina Safiya, who were younger than her, and that she was very close to the three, that once Sayyidina Aisha and Sayyidina Hafsa were sitting there with Sayyidina Sauda, and they knew that she feared speech about the Dajjal and the coming of the Dajjal, and that so they began to speak, Sayyidina Aisha and Sayyidina Hafsa, amongst themselves about the Dajjal. And as they begin to speak about the Dajjal, and then they know that Sayyidina Sauda is fearful, that she runs and she hides, and she runs into this dark room into a corner where there's cobwebs and the like, and she's hiding there. And Sayyidina Aisha and Sayyidina Hafsa begin to laugh and having a laugh at Sayyidina Sauda. She's hiding in the corner, and the Prophet ﷺ walks in, and he says, what are you laughing about? And they say, Sayyidina Sauda she's hiding, and this is what's happened. So the Prophet ﷺ, he laughs, and he calls Sayyidina Sauda, and she comes out, and she's covered in cobwebs, and she's laughing and giggling herself because she's shy, bashful, that she was fearful, and she hid into this corner upon hearing the news of the Dajjal. And she began to laugh herself. And so most of the time the jokes were at her own cost, but she was somebody who was always entered joy and happiness into the hearts of others. So now we see that after this, the Prophet ﷺ, also in this year, the 10th year, that he goes to Ta'if, and Ta'if is a place just outside Mecca, and where he sees that the people in Mecca are no longer listening to him and accepting his message. So he goes to the people of Ta'if to call them to Islam. And you see again, the Prophet ﷺ never gives up, that he continued his message. It didn't matter whatever difficulties he faced, he continued calling to Islam. And so he goes to Ta'if with Zayd bin Haritha, and when he spends time there calling him to Islam, and finally they throw him out, and to mock him and to shame him, they say, they ask the young children of the city to stone him, and Sayyidina Zayd. And so when they walk him out, they begin to stone him, the children are stoning him, and he would fall and collapse, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he's bleeding, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And that when he would fall and collapse, they would pick him up again and make him walk again, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then he was bleeding and he'd fall again, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And again they would pick him up and keep doing this. And then until finally he, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he reaches a tree just at the garden of Utbah bin Rabi'ah. And Utbah bin Rabi'ah, who was one of the enemies of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And his two sons are in the garden, and they see the Prophet ﷺ, and they're not Muslim, but they feel some compassion that this is one of ours, he's one of our people, and that this is what's happening to him. So they send to their young slave boy Addas, and they say to him, go and take these grapes to him. And so Addas goes to the Prophet ﷺ, this young boy, and he takes this plate of grapes to him, and he gives it to the Prophet ﷺ. As the Prophet ﷺ reaches for him, he says, Bismillah. And when Addas hears this, he says, these are not the words of the people from around here. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Nineveh. And he says, I'm a Christian from Nineveh. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, oh, from the place, same place as the righteous servant of Allah, Yunus. And when Addas hears this, and he says, how do you know about Yunus, alayhi salam? And so the Prophet ﷺ, he says, he is my brother, and he was a prophet, and so am I. And so Addas, upon hearing this, he begins to kiss the hands and the feet of the Prophet ﷺ. And so we see here, even through all this difficulty that he faced in Mecca, and then he went to Ta'if, ﷺ, and in Ta'if he faced all these difficulties, and he was stoned, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he bled and he collapsed, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards him with what? This young boy who comes to him, and that out of nowhere this young boy comes to him and he accepts Islam and he becomes Muslim. And all of that was worth it for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, for this one person becoming Muslim and guiding one person back to the truth. And so we see now that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, also here, this is where he makes his famous dua, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, where Jibreel comes to him and he says, I have the angel of the mountains here who will collapse these mountains upon these people, and people will never know they existed. And so the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says, no, rather I pray that from their lineage, from their children come those who are upon this religion. And so the Prophet ﷺ here, he raised his hands to Allah and he says, I complain to you about my weakness, and I complain to you about my lack of means, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, where the people are not listening to him, and yet he's complaining to his Lord about himself, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This is a lesson for us, that we shouldn't put the blame upon others, but rather look at ourselves as the weakness. And there was nothing weak about the Prophet ﷺ, and he fell short in no regards, but yet that's what he did. And so the sunnah is that when we see something, we look at the weakness in ourselves, and we're the ones who are falling short in our worship and in our service to this religion. So inshallah we will stop there, and then tomorrow we will look at the migration probably, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ya Rabbana atarafna biannana iqtarafna wa annana asrafna ala ladha ashrafna fatub alayna tawba taghsil li kulli hawba wastunna nar arati wa amiruati waghfir li walidina rabbi wa mawlidina wa ahli wal ikhwani wa sa'iri al khillani وكل ذي محبة أو جيرة وصحبة والمسلمين أجمع آمين ربي اسمع فضلا وجود منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي وصلى وسلم ربي عليه عد الهب وآله وصحبه إدادة تش صحبه والحمد لله في البدء والتناهي سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين في كل لحظة أبدا عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه الفاتحة.